Some reunions bring back memories. Others bring back the truth. The Northgate Ballroom in downtown Chicago glowed with warm amber light, crystal chandeliers reflecting across polished marble floors as laughter and polite conversations drifted through the air like expensive perfume. 10 years had passed since the class of 2014 had last walked the halls of their old high school. But tonight the familiar faces had gathered again, dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses, each person quietly measuring how far the others had climbed. At the center of the room stood Daniel Hayes. He looked exactly like the man people expected him to become. Tall, confident, his navy suit perfectly cut, a glass of champagne resting casually in his hand. A successful corporate attorney now, Daniel carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone used to winning rooms without trying. Beside him stood his new wife, Lauren, radiant in a deep red evening dress, her hand lightly resting on his arm as their old classmates circled around them with admiration. Daniel Hayes, one former classmate laughed, clinking glasses with him. The guy who used to sleep through economics is now one of the top attorneys in Chicago. Daniel smiled modestly, but the pride in his eyes was impossible to miss. Guess people change, he said smoothly. Someone else leaned in, lowering their voice slightly. So whatever happened to Claire? You two were married for a while, right? The question floated through the small circle like a pebble tossed into still water. Daniel paused for only half a second before letting out a soft chuckle. Claire, he repeated, as if the name belonged to a distant memory. She disappeared after the divorce. I guess some people just aren't built for the real world. A few quiet laughs followed. Lauren smiled politely, though she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the tone. Daniel lifted his glass again, ready to move the conversation along, when suddenly the tall ballroom doors opened. The soft music continued playing, but something about the shift in the room was immediate. A subtle pause. A flicker of curiosity. A woman stepped inside. At first, no one reacted. She wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, the kind of dress that didn't demand attention but quietly held it anyway. Her dark hair rested neatly over her shoulders, and she carried herself with a calm confidence that felt different from the nervous energy filling the room. Claire Bennett had arrived. For a moment, Daniel's smile froze. He recognized her instantly. Of course he did. You don't forget someone you once built a life with. But instead of reacting, instead of acknowledging her presence, Daniel simply turned slightly toward another conversation, deliberately looking past her, as if she were invisible. Claire noticed. Of course she did. But she didn't stop walking. She moved slowly through the ballroom, the soft sound of her heels echoing against the marble floor as old classmates began whispering quietly to one another. Some recognized her. Some didn't. Time had changed people. Daniel continued speaking to his group as if nothing had happened. Anyway, he said lightly, adjusting his cufflink. Some people are meant to move forward. Others just fade away. And for a moment, it seemed like he believed it. Until the host of the evening stepped onto the small stage near the center of the ballroom and tapped the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, the host announced warmly, before we continue tonight's reunion celebration, we'd like to take a moment to thank the organization that made this entire event possible. A large screen behind the stage flickered to life. Daniel barely glanced up, but Claire stopped walking. And somewhere deep in the room, something important was about to change. The glow from the giant screen washed across the ballroom as conversations slowly faded into silence. Daniel Hayes barely paid attention at first. Events like this always had sponsors, and most of the time it was just another corporation looking for recognition. He lifted his champagne glass again, half listening as the host continued speaking near the stage. Tonight's reunion is made possible thanks to the generosity of the Bennett Foundation. The words rolled gently across the room, but they did not seem to mean much to most people. Chicago was full of foundations and wealthy donors. Daniel glanced casually toward the screen, already preparing to turn back to his conversation. Then the image appeared. A photograph of a distinguished older man filled the screen behind the host. Silver hair, calm eyes, the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of building something powerful. Beneath the image, bold letters appeared. Victor Bennett, founder of Bennett Global Industries. A faint ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Several people murmured quietly. The Bennett name carried weight in Chicago. For decades, the company had shaped everything from commercial real estate to technology investments. It was the kind of empire most people only read about in financial magazines. Daniel noticed the whispers and gave a slight shrug. Big company, he said casually to the group around him. Chicago has a few of those. But across the ballroom, Claire Bennett stood still. The soft light from the chandeliers reflected across the polished floor as she watched the screen with calm, steady eyes. She did not look surprised. If anything, she looked patient. The host smiled warmly at the audience. Victor Bennett believed strongly in education, community, and the importance of supporting the next generation. The foundation that bears his name continues that mission today. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, growing a little bored with the speech. Lauren leaned closer to him. Bennett Global is huge, right? She whispered quietly. I think my firm worked on a contract with them last year. Daniel nodded. They are old money. Legacy business. Nothing unusual. But then the host continued. And tonight we are honored to have someone very special with us. The words seemed simple, but they changed the atmosphere instantly. People straightened slightly, curiosity spreading through the crowd like a spark. The host gestured toward the audience. Please join me in welcoming the sole heir to the Bennett Foundation and the future leader of Bennett Global Industries. Daniel turned toward the stage again, this time paying attention. Around the ballroom, people began quietly scanning the room, wondering which powerful guest had arrived without anyone noticing. The host smiled and spoke clearly into the microphone. Miss Claire Bennett. For a brief moment, the room did not react at all. The name floated through the air as if no one quite understood it yet. Then heads began turning, one by one, slowly, toward the woman standing quietly near the center of the ballroom. Claire Bennett. Daniel Hayes felt something strange tighten in his chest. His hand stopped halfway to his glass as his eyes finally landed on her again. Claire did not rush. She simply began walking toward the stage with the same calm composure she had carried when she entered the room. Each step echoed softly across the marble floor. Conversations disappeared entirely now. The room watched her move forward as the pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. Inside dozens of curious minds. Daniel stared, his confident smile slowly fading as a single realization began forming, one he was not prepared for. The woman he had just dismissed as someone who faded away had just been introduced as the heir to one of the largest business empires in the city. Claire Bennett stepped onto the small stage as the soft murmur of disbelief spread through the ballroom like a quiet storm. The chandeliers above cast warm light across the polished floor, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Up close, Claire looked exactly as Daniel remembered her in some ways, yet completely different in others. The same calm eyes, the same quiet presence. But there was something new now, something steady and unshakable, like a woman who had finally stepped fully into her own life. The host handed her the microphone with a respectful smile. Miss Bennett, we are honored to have you here tonight. Claire accepted it with a polite nod, her fingers resting lightly against the metal as she turned toward the audience. Dozens of familiar faces stared back at her. Former classmates, old acquaintances, people who once thought they knew exactly who she was. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear. It is strange being back here after 10 years. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, easing some of the tension. The last time most of us stood in a room together like this, we were still trying to figure out what our lives would become. She paused for a moment, letting her gaze move slowly across the room. It passed over curious faces, surprised expressions, and finally landed briefly on Daniel Hayes. He stood frozen near the bar, his glass untouched in his hand. Claire did not linger on him. She simply continued speaking. Many of you knew me by a different name back then. The words were gentle, but they carried weight. For a while, I was Claire Hayes. A few people in the room exchanged glances, remembering the marriage that had once seemed so certain, so permanent. Claire smiled faintly, not with bitterness but with quiet understanding. But long before that, and long after, my name has always been Claire Bennett. The large screen behind her shifted again, revealing the skyline headquarters of Bennett Global Industries, a towering glass building that dominated one of Chicago's busiest financial districts. The image glowed behind her like a silent confirmation of everything the room was only beginning to understand. Claire continued calmly. My grandfather built the first part of Bennett Global more than 60 years ago. My father expanded it. And after my uncle Victor passed away last year, the responsibility for the company came to me. Another ripple moved through the crowd, louder this time, filled with shock and fascination. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs slowly as the reality settled around him. The woman he had dismissed moments ago had just revealed herself as the heir to one of the largest business empires in the city. Claire spoke again, her tone steady. For a long time I stayed away from the public side of the company. I preferred working quietly behind the scenes, learning the business the way my family believed it should be learned. Her eyes moved across the room once more, thoughtful but composed. But tonight felt like the right time to step forward. The host nodded with admiration as the crowd slowly began to applaud, the sound growing stronger with each passing second. Claire offered a graceful smile, acknowledging the applause without letting it change her calm posture. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally lowered his glass. The confidence that had surrounded him earlier in the evening had quietly disappeared. For the first time that night, he understood something he had never considered before. The woman he believed had faded from his world had simply been preparing to walk into a much larger one. The applause rolled through the ballroom like a rising tide, filling the high ceilings of the Northgate Ballroom with a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and disbelief. Claire Bennett lowered the microphone gently and offered a polite nod to the host before stepping away from the center of the stage. The screen behind her slowly faded back to the reunion banner, but the energy in the room had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. Conversations began again almost immediately, but they were different now. People leaned toward one another, whispering quietly, their eyes drifting repeatedly toward Claire as she stepped down from the stage. Several former classmates approached her with wide smiles and eager greetings, the kind that carried a hint of nervous excitement. A woman who had once shared biology class with her shook her head in amazement. "Claire, I had no idea," she said, her voice full of astonishment. "You were always so quiet back then." Claire smiled gently. "I suppose I still am." The woman laughed lightly, though it was clear she was still processing the revelation. "Well, quiet or not, you certainly surprised everyone tonight." Claire accepted the comment with a calm nod. She had learned long ago that surprises were often simply the result of people believing they understood someone when they did not. Across the room, Daniel Hayes stood near the bar, but he no longer seemed like the center of attention. Only an hour earlier the crowd had gathered around him, laughing at his stories and admiring his success. Now the circle around him had quietly dissolved. Some people had drifted toward Claire. Others had moved into small groups, discussing the news with animated expressions. Lauren shifted slightly beside him, watching the scene unfold. "Daniel," she said quietly, "did you know?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Claire as she spoke with a group of classmates. She looked comfortable, composed, entirely at ease in a moment that would have overwhelmed most people. The realization settled deeper in his chest with every passing second. He had not just ignored her earlier. He had dismissed her. Lauren tried again, her voice softer this time. "You were married to her for 2 years." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yes." The word came out quieter than he expected. On the other side of the ballroom, Claire continued speaking with several people who had approached her. Someone asked her about Bennett Global, and she answered with the same thoughtful calm she had shown on stage. She described the company not as an empire, but as a responsibility her family had carried for generations. Her tone remained steady, almost humble, which only seemed to deepen the fascination surrounding her. Eventually the small crowd around her began to shift as the evening resumed its natural rhythm. The music returned softly, glasses clinked again, and conversations resumed. Claire thanked the last person in the group and turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room. For the first time since leaving the stage, her eyes met Daniel's again. The distance between them was less than 30 feet, yet it felt far greater than that. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, uncertain of what expression he should wear. Apology felt too late. Confidence felt impossible. Claire simply offered a small, polite smile. It was not mocking. It was not triumphant. It was the calm acknowledgement of someone who had already moved beyond the past. Then she turned and walked toward the far side of the ballroom, leaving Daniel standing quietly in a room that suddenly felt very different from the one he had entered earlier that evening. Claire Bennett moved through the far side of the ballroom with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening, but the atmosphere around her had changed completely. A few minutes earlier she had entered the reunion almost unnoticed, another familiar face returning after years away. Now every movement she made seemed to draw subtle attention. Conversations paused when she passed. Curious glances followed her from across the room. The soft music drifting through the ballroom suddenly felt like the background to something much larger than a simple reunion. Claire paused near one of the tall windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched across the night like scattered stars, reflecting faintly against the glass. For a brief moment she allowed herself a quiet breath. It had taken years to reach this point, years of patience and discipline, years of choosing silence instead of explanations. Behind her, the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer. Claire. The voice carried hesitation, something that would have been unthinkable for Daniel Hayes earlier that evening. She turned slowly. Daniel stood a few feet away, his confident posture replaced with something far more uncertain. The polished ease that had surrounded him at the beginning of the night was gone. Now he looked like a man trying to understand a story that had suddenly changed chapters without warning. For a moment neither of them spoke. The music played softly behind them, and the low hum of conversations continued across the ballroom. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "I did not know," he said carefully. Claire studied him with calm eyes. "No," she replied gently. "You did not." The simplicity of the answer made him shift slightly. "You never mentioned anything about Bennett Global when we were married." Claire gave a faint smile, not defensive, simply reflective. "You never asked." The words were not sharp, but they landed with quiet accuracy. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing down at his hands before looking back at her. "I thought I understood your world back then." Claire looked toward the window again, the reflection of city lights moving softly across the glass. "Most people think they understand someone," she said calmly, "until they realize they were only seeing the part that was convenient." Daniel absorbed that in silence. Across the ballroom, a few classmates were watching them discreetly, pretending not to notice the conversation unfolding near the window. Lauren remained near the bar, speaking politely with another guest, but glancing over occasionally. Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now. "You disappeared after the divorce." Claire shook her head slightly. "I did not disappear." Her eyes returned to him, steady and clear. "I went back to the life I had always planned to live." Daniel felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the quiet space between them. For years he had believed the story was simple. A marriage that had not worked. A quiet woman who had faded into the background after their separation. But standing here now, he understood something that had never occurred to him before. Claire had not faded at all. She had simply stepped into a world he had never taken the time to see. Claire glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where laughter rose again as the evening continued. "It looks like the reunion is finally starting to feel like a reunion again," she said lightly. Daniel followed her gaze, still processing everything that had unfolded in the last 20 minutes. Claire turned back to him once more, offering the same calm, polite smile she had given earlier. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." Then she stepped away, leaving him standing near the window while the realization slowly settled in that the woman he once believed he had left behind had quietly built a future far larger than anything he had imagined. Claire Bennett crossed the ballroom slowly, the soft rhythm of the music blending with the low murmur of conversations that had resumed after her announcement. Yet the air still carried a quiet awareness that had not existed earlier in the evening. People noticed her now, not in the obvious way of someone seeking attention, but with the subtle curiosity reserved for someone whose story had suddenly become larger than anyone expected. Near the center of the room, a group of former classmates stepped aside as she passed, offering warm greetings and respectful smiles. One of them, a man who had once sat 2 rows behind her in history class, shook his head in disbelief. "Claire, I still cannot believe that was you on stage," he said with a friendly laugh. "You were always the quiet one." Claire smiled gently, accepting the comment without correcting it. "Quiet does not always mean small," she replied softly. The man nodded thoughtfully, as if realizing he had never considered that before. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes remained near the tall window where she had left him. The city lights outside stretched across the glass like a reflection of another world, one that suddenly felt very distant from the one he thought he understood. Lauren approached him cautiously, holding her glass of sparkling water. "Are you all right?" she asked. Daniel nodded automatically, though his expression remained distant. "Yes," he said, but the word carried uncertainty. Lauren followed his gaze toward Claire, who now stood speaking with two former teachers who had been invited to the reunion. "She seems different from the person you described," Lauren said carefully. Daniel did not answer immediately. He watched Claire listening attentively to the older couple, nodding politely as they spoke. There was nothing dramatic about her presence. No grand gestures. No attempt to impress anyone. Yet the calm confidence surrounding her was impossible to ignore. "I thought I knew who she was," Daniel said finally. Lauren studied him for a moment before replying gently. "Maybe you knew part of her." The music shifted to a slower melody as the evening continued. Waiters moved quietly through the room carrying trays of drinks while clusters of classmates shared memories and stories from the last decade. But every few minutes someone new approached Claire, eager to speak with the woman whose name had suddenly become the center of the night's conversations. Claire handled each interaction with the same steady grace. She listened more than she spoke, answered questions with patience, and never once appeared overwhelmed by the attention surrounding her. Eventually, she stepped away from the group and moved toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, where a small table overlooked the dance floor. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a moment to simply observe the room. The laughter, the music, the familiar faces now older but still carrying traces of their younger selves. 10 years earlier, she had stood in this same building during senior prom, uncertain about the future and trusting the person who stood beside her then. Life had taken a very different path since that night. Claire reached for a glass of water from the table and took a small sip, her eyes thoughtful but peaceful. Across the ballroom, Daniel continued watching her, the distance between them filled not with anger or regret, but with a quiet realization he could not ignore. The woman he once believed needed his world had quietly built a far greater one of her own. The music drifted softly across the ballroom as the evening continued, but the quiet shift in attention had not faded. Claire Bennett remained seated near the corner table overlooking the dance floor, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the cool glass of water in front of her. From that quiet vantage point, she watched the room the same way someone watches a familiar story unfold again after many years. Former classmates laughed near the bar. A group gathered near the center of the floor reminiscing about old teachers and forgotten classes. The warm glow of the chandeliers reflected off polished marble and champagne glasses, filling the room with a golden softness that almost made the evening feel nostalgic. Yet beneath that comfortable surface, something subtle had changed. Claire could feel it in the occasional glances that drifted toward her table, in the quiet curiosity that followed her presence now. People were trying to reconcile the memory they held of the quiet girl from high school with the woman who had just been introduced as the heir to one of the most powerful companies in Chicago. Claire did not seem bothered by it. If anything, she appeared completely at ease with the contrast. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes remained standing near the tall window, but he was no longer watching the skyline. His attention had returned to Claire more than once without him realizing it. Lauren noticed again. "You have not moved from that spot for 10 minutes, she said gently. Daniel gave a small, distracted smile. "I guess tonight turned out to be more surprising than I expected." Lauren studied his expression. "You were thinking about the past." Daniel did not deny it. His eyes shifted again toward Claire. She was now speaking with a former classmate who had pulled out a phone, probably asking for a photo or a business contact. Claire listened politely and nodded, but there was no eagerness in her posture, no attempt to impress anyone. She seemed comfortable simply being present. Lauren spoke again, her voice thoughtful rather than critical. "It must be strange seeing someone you thought you understood turn out to be completely different." Daniel considered the words carefully. "She is not completely different," he said slowly. "I think she was always like this. I just never paid attention." The realization lingered in the quiet space between them. At the corner table, Claire finished her conversation and stood again, smoothing the fabric of her black dress. As she stepped away from the table, another familiar voice greeted her. "Claire Bennett. I should have guessed." Claire turned to see Professor Martin Reynolds approaching with a warm smile. He had been the economics teacher during their senior year, known for pushing students to think beyond the obvious answers. His gray hair had thinned slightly over the years, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes remained the same. Claire's expression brightened with genuine warmth. "Professor Reynolds," she said, extending her hand. "It has been a long time." He laughed softly. "I remember you sitting in the second row of my class, always listening more than speaking. But when you did speak, it was usually the most thoughtful comment in the room." Claire smiled modestly. "You always encouraged us to see the bigger picture." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "And it seems you did exactly that." Their conversation continued easily, filled with the comfortable respect between teacher and former student. Across the ballroom, Daniel watched the exchange quietly. For the first time that evening, he understood something with complete clarity. Claire had not become impressive tonight. She had simply revealed a life she had been building all along, one thoughtful decision at a time. Professor Reynolds and Claire Bennett continued their conversation near the edge of the dance floor while the evening slowly regained its rhythm. The soft glow from the chandeliers shimmered across the polished marble floor, and the gentle hum of music filled the spaces between laughter and old memories. Reynolds folded his arms thoughtfully as he studied Claire for a moment. "I have followed Bennett Global for years," he said with quiet admiration. "Your family built something extraordinary." Claire nodded politely. "My grandfather believed that companies should last longer than the people who build them. He used to say that success is not about how quickly something grows, but how long it stands." Reynolds smiled at the familiar echo of his own lectures. "That sounds exactly like the lesson I tried to teach in class." Claire laughed softly. "You were one of the reasons I chose to study economics seriously." The professor raised an eyebrow with interest. "Really?" Claire nodded. "You once said that the strongest leaders are the ones who listen longer than they speak." Reynolds chuckled gently. "I suppose you took that advice more seriously than most of your classmates." Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes watched the conversation continue. Something about the exchange felt strangely distant, like observing a story from outside a window. The version of Claire he remembered had always been thoughtful and quiet, but he had never imagined the depth of the life she was quietly building even then. Lauren stood beside him, her posture calm but observant. "She seems very comfortable in this world," Lauren said softly. Daniel nodded slowly. "It looks like she always was." Lauren studied him carefully. "You sound like you were seeing her for the first time." Daniel gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Maybe I am." Near the dance floor, a group of former classmates began gathering for photographs, calling out names and laughing as they pulled people closer together. One of them spotted Claire speaking with Professor Reynolds and waved enthusiastically. "Claire, come join us," the woman called. "We need one photo with the most successful person in the room." Claire raised a hand politely, clearly amused by the comment. "I do not think success works that way," she replied lightly, but she walked over to join them anyway. The group shifted to make space as the photographer raised a phone and counted down. 3, 2, 1. The camera flashed, capturing a moment that none of them would have imagined when they graduated 10 years earlier. Claire stood among them, smiling naturally, not as someone seeking admiration, but simply as someone who had grown into her life. As the group dispersed again, Claire stepped aside and glanced briefly across the room. Her eyes landed once more on Daniel. The look lasted only a moment, but it was enough for both of them to recognize how much time had passed between who they once were and who they had become. Daniel felt the quiet weight of that realization settle inside him. Claire did not look angry. She did not look bitter. She simply looked like someone who had moved forward while the rest of the room was only just beginning to understand how far she had traveled. The camera flashes faded and the laughter around the photo group slowly dissolved back into the gentle rhythm of the evening. Claire Bennett stepped away from the group with the same calm grace she had carried all night, the soft music drifting across the ballroom as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the energy in the room still felt subtly different. Conversations had shifted. The story of the night had quietly changed, and everyone seemed aware of it even if no one said it aloud. Claire walked toward the refreshment table near the far wall and reached for another glass of water. The cool surface of the glass felt grounding in her hand. She had not come to the reunion to make an announcement or create a moment. She had simply come because, after 10 years, it felt right to close a chapter that once defined her life. A familiar voice spoke behind her. "You handled that better than most people would." Claire turned to see Professor Reynolds standing nearby again, holding a cup of coffee. "Handled what?" she asked with a gentle smile. He gestured lightly toward the ballroom. "The attention. The surprise." Most people would enjoy being the center of the room. Claire shook her head slightly. I never wanted to be the center of the room. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. No, you always preferred to understand the room instead. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes slowly moved away from the window for the first time since their earlier conversation. The music continued playing, couples beginning to step onto the dance floor while others gathered near the bar. Yet Daniel felt strangely separate from the evening now. Lauren noticed his movement. Are you going over there? She asked quietly. Daniel hesitated for a moment. I'm not sure that would make sense anymore. Lauren considered that carefully. Maybe not for the past, she said gently. But people change. Daniel looked toward Claire again. She stood calmly speaking with Professor Reynolds, her posture relaxed, her expression thoughtful. There was no sign of triumph in her demeanor, no sense of proving anything. If anything, she looked exactly like the woman he remembered in the early days of their relationship, someone who preferred quiet conversations over loud celebrations. The difference now was that the quiet confidence around her felt unmistakable. Daniel finally stepped forward. The distance between them was only a few dozen feet, but each step seemed heavier with realization. When he reached them, Professor Reynolds noticed him first. Daniel Hayes, the professor said warmly. It has been a long time. Daniel nodded respectfully. Good evening, Professor. Claire turned toward him with calm curiosity. For a moment the three of them stood together in the soft glow of the ballroom lights. Daniel spoke carefully. I was thinking about something you said earlier. Claire tilted her head slightly. Which part? Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. The part where you said you did not disappear. Claire studied him quietly, waiting. Daniel continued slowly. You were right. You did not disappear. I think the truth is that I stopped paying attention. Claire's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with quiet understanding. She took a sip of water before answering. Sometimes people grow in different directions, she said gently. That does not mean either of them failed. The words were simple, yet they carried the calm finality of someone who had already made peace with the past. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time that evening, he realized something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Claire Bennett had never needed the room to see her value. She had always known it herself. Professor Reynolds excused himself politely a few minutes later, leaving Claire Bennett and Daniel Hayes standing near the refreshment table as the evening continued around them. The music shifted again, a familiar song from their senior year echoing softly through the ballroom. Several classmates laughed when they recognized it, and a few couples moved toward the dance floor with nostalgic smiles. Claire rested her hand lightly against the edge of the table, watching the room with calm attention. Daniel stood beside her, still adjusting to the quiet clarity that had settled between them. Do you remember this song? He asked after a moment. Claire listened for a second and nodded. Senior prom, she said. You insisted we stay until the very last song. Daniel let out a small laugh. I remember thinking that night was the beginning of everything. Claire looked toward the dance floor where people were swaying slowly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. In a way it was, she said thoughtfully. Just not in the way we expected. Daniel studied her expression carefully. There was no trace of resentment in her voice, only reflection. Did you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Claire glanced back at him, her eyes thoughtful but steady. Regret what? The years we spent together. Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. No, she said gently. Every part of life teaches you something, even the chapters that do not last. Daniel absorbed the words slowly. For years he had believed their divorce marked a failure in his life story, something to move past quickly so he could focus on the next step. But standing here now, he realized Claire had treated the experience very differently. To her it had simply been part of a longer journey. The music swelled slightly as more couples joined the dance floor. Claire watched them for a moment, a faint smile touching her lips. You always liked crowded rooms, she said lightly. You enjoyed the energy. Daniel nodded. And you always preferred the quiet corners. Claire looked amused. Someone has to observe what is happening. Daniel followed her gaze across the ballroom. The evening now felt relaxed again, as if the earlier surprise had blended naturally into the flow of the reunion. Yet he knew something had changed for him personally. I used to think success meant being noticed by everyone in the room, he said slowly. Claire tilted her head slightly. And now? Daniel looked at her with a thoughtful expression. Now I think it might mean building something meaningful even when no one is watching. Claire gave a small approving nod. That sounds like a lesson Professor Reynolds would appreciate. They both smiled softly at the comment. A brief silence followed, comfortable rather than awkward. The past they shared no longer felt heavy between them. It simply existed as part of the story that brought them to this moment. Daniel finally glanced toward Lauren, who stood speaking with a few classmates near the bar. Life turned out differently than either of us expected, he said. Claire looked toward the tall windows where the Chicago skyline shimmered against the night sky. Life usually does, she replied. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time that evening he understood something with quiet certainty. Claire Bennett had never been trying to prove anything to the room or to him. She had simply lived her life with patience and purpose until the world eventually noticed. And somehow, that realization made the room feel a little larger and the past feel much smaller. The music continued to flow through the ballroom like a gentle current carrying the evening forward, and the atmosphere had softened into something warmer, almost reflective. Claire Bennett and Daniel Hayes remained near the refreshment table, their earlier conversation settling into a quiet understanding that did not need many words. Across the room, laughter rose as someone shared an old story about a high school football game, and the crowd responded with the easy familiarity of people revisiting a time that once shaped them all. Claire watched the dance floor where a few couples were now swaying slowly beneath the chandelier lights. The glow reflected off the polished marble and the tall glass windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, giving the entire room a calm elegance that felt almost timeless. Daniel followed her gaze. You always liked observing people, he said thoughtfully. I remember you used to sit near the edge of every party and just watch everything happening. Claire smiled faintly. It is easier to understand a room when you are not trying to control it. Daniel considered that for a moment. It was the kind of insight he might have overlooked years ago, but now it felt strangely meaningful. The music shifted again, and a new wave of conversations filled the ballroom. Lauren approached them, her expression warm and composed. Claire, she said politely, extending her hand. I do not think we have properly met tonight. Claire accepted the gesture with calm friendliness. It is nice to meet you, Lauren. Lauren smiled. I have heard a lot about you over the years, though clearly not the full story. Claire gave a small laugh at that. Most stories are larger than the parts people remember. Lauren nodded thoughtfully, then glanced toward Daniel before speaking again. I want you to know something, she said gently. When Daniel told me about your marriage, he never spoke about you with resentment. It always sounded like a chapter he respected, even if it ended. Daniel looked slightly surprised by the comment, but Claire did not seem unsettled by it. She simply nodded. That is kind of you to say. Lauren's tone remained sincere. Seeing you tonight makes it clear that both of you simply moved forward in different directions. Claire's eyes softened slightly. Sometimes that is the healthiest outcome. A comfortable silence followed. The music drifted softly through the room while the crowd continued enjoying the reunion, no longer focused on the earlier surprise, but still aware of the quiet story that had unfolded throughout the evening. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm. You seem happy. Claire did not answer immediately. She looked around the ballroom once more, at the familiar faces, the warm lights, the city stretching beyond the windows. Then she nodded. Yes, she said simply. I am. There was no dramatic declaration in the word, only the quiet certainty of someone who had taken the time to build a life that felt authentic. Daniel accepted the answer with a thoughtful nod of his own. For the first time in many years, he realized that the ending of their marriage had not been the end of Claire Bennett's story. It had only been the moment when her real path finally had room to begin. The evening had settled into its final rhythm as the reunion moved toward its quieter hours. The dance floor was still alive with movement, but the energy had softened, the earlier excitement transforming into the comfortable nostalgia that reunions often carried near the end of the night. Claire Bennett stood near the tall windows overlooking the Chicago skyline once again, the reflection of the city lights stretching across the glass like a quiet reminder of how far the world extended beyond this single ballroom. She watched the movement of the room with the same calm attention she had carried all evening. People were laughing, reconnecting, exchanging contact information, promising to meet again before another decade slipped away. The night had become less about the past and more about the paths each of them had traveled since leaving these halls as teenagers. Behind her, Daniel Hayes approached slowly, though this time there was no hesitation in his steps. The earlier uncertainty between them had settled into something more balanced, something respectful. "It is strange," he said gently as he joined her by the window. Claire turned slightly toward him. "What is?" Daniel gestured toward the room. 10 years ago we all believed we knew exactly where our lives were going." Claire followed his gaze toward the dance floor where several classmates were laughing as they attempted an old dance they barely remembered. "Life rarely follows the plans we make at 18, she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I used to think that meant something went wrong." Claire studied the skyline beyond the glass for a moment before answering. "Sometimes it simply means something better was waiting somewhere else." Daniel considered that quietly. The reflection of the city lights shimmered faintly across the window beside them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt reflective, like two people finally understanding the full shape of a story that once seemed confusing. Daniel spoke again after a moment. "Do you ever come back here often?" Claire smiled faintly. "Not really. My work keeps me traveling most of the year." Daniel raised an eyebrow with interest. "International projects?" Claire nodded. "Bennett Global has expanded into renewable infrastructure in several countries. My role requires a lot of time overseas." Daniel exhaled quietly, impressed despite himself. "You built something remarkable." Claire shook her head gently. "My family built the foundation. I am simply continuing the work." Daniel looked around the ballroom again. For the first time that evening, he noticed how many people were watching Claire with admiration, even if they tried to hide it. Yet she seemed untouched by the attention, as comfortable by the window as she had been when she first entered the room unnoticed. Lauren approached them again, her expression warm. "They are gathering everyone for one final group photo," she said. Claire glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where a cluster of classmates was waving people over. She smiled softly. "Then we should probably join them." The three of them walked back toward the center of the room, where the crowd gathered beneath the chandelier lights. As the photographer raised the camera, people shifted closer together, laughing as they tried to fit everyone into the frame. Claire stood among them easily, no longer the quiet girl people remembered nor the surprising headline of the night, but simply one of many lives that had grown in unexpected directions. The camera flashed brightly, capturing the moment forever. And in that frozen instant, the room held something simple and powerful at the same time. Not a story of revenge, not a story of regret, just the quiet proof that sometimes the most remarkable transformations happen when no one is watching. The bright flash of the camera faded, and the group slowly broke apart into smaller clusters of conversation, laughter, and quiet reflection. For a moment, the center of the ballroom remained filled with the warm energy of people who had just shared something simple but meaningful together. Claire Bennett stepped back from the group, smoothing the edge of her black dress as the photographer lowered the camera, and several classmates began joking about how different everyone looked compared to their graduation photos. The music continued softly, a gentle piano melody drifting through the air as the reunion reached its final hour. Claire moved once again toward the tall windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, the familiar place she had returned to several times during the evening. Outside, the city stretched endlessly beneath the night sky, thousands of lights forming patterns across the streets and buildings. It was a reminder that the world was always much larger than any single room, any single moment. Daniel Hayes watched her walk there again, and this time he did not follow. Instead, he remained near the center of the ballroom, observing the room with a perspective he had not possessed when the evening began. Lauren stood beside him quietly. "You look like you are thinking about something important," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I am thinking about how easy it is to misunderstand someone when you only see one part of their life." Lauren followed his gaze toward Claire by the window. "She seems very sure of who she is," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think she always was." Near the window, Claire rested her hand lightly against the cool glass and looked out across the skyline once more. The city felt alive in the distance, the quiet pulse of 1,000 lives continuing beyond this small reunion of the past. A few moments later, Professor Reynolds joined her again, standing beside her with a thoughtful smile. "You handled tonight with remarkable grace," he said. Claire gave a small laugh. "It was just a reunion." Reynolds shook his head gently. "It was more than that for many people in this room. They saw something tonight they did not expect." Claire looked back toward the ballroom where classmates were still talking and laughing. People often expect the world to stay the way they remember it, she said softly. But life keeps moving. Reynolds nodded approvingly. And the people who move with it are usually the ones who build the future. Claire smiled quietly at the thought. After a moment, she glanced toward the entrance where a driver would soon be waiting to take her back to the airport for an early morning flight. Her schedule rarely allowed her to stay in one place for long. Projects, meetings, and decisions awaited her in cities far beyond Chicago. Yet tonight had given her something rare. Closure. Across the ballroom, Daniel noticed her looking toward the exit and understood immediately. Some people return to the past only briefly before continuing forward. Claire Bennett was clearly one of those people. She took one final look around the ballroom. The music, the laughter, the familiar faces now touched by time. Then she walked calmly toward the doors. No announcement. No dramatic farewell. Just a quiet exit. Daniel watched her leave with a thoughtful expression, understanding something at last that he had missed years ago. Some people do not seek revenge, applause, or recognition. They simply become the person they were meant to be. And by the time the world finally notices, they are already far ahead, walking confidently toward the life they built for themselves.